My name is Nathaniel Tran, and the following is my presentation on the literary theory of postmodernism. Now, before we get into the definition of postmodernism in a literary theory, I think we need to first talk about postmodernism in the perspective of a movement. Now, postmodernism in general is a heavily debated theory talked among critics and theorists. A lot of people don't know essentially where to pinpoint it in history, and a lot of people have trouble talking about the qualities of it, what is right, what is wrong, is this a good thing, is it a bad thing. But if we look at the hardcore evidence and look at the facts, we see that postmodernism started and was coined by John Francis Lyotard in 1984 in his book, The Postmodern Condition. In this book, he criticizes the modernistic kind of movement and introduces a theory that questions unified truth. What I mean by unified truth is that of science, religion, language, and essentially the culture of modernistic ideals. As we can see, postmodernism correlates directly with modernism, as the name suggests, postmodernism. It was developed during the early 1800s as Western European literature, art, and ideas that promoted a progressive and developed society. Now, postmodernism, we see, is a movement that builds upon modernism, and not only that, more so rejects modernistic ideas. A very subjective way of thinking towards art, politics, religion, and morality is kind of what postmodernism talks about. And it believes that truth in art, in science, in religion, in language, is very relative. But in terms of writing, this literary theory is kind of follows that statement, is that it is a evolution from modernism as a subjective way of thinking. But looking into postmodernism in literary theory, we see that postmodernism takes the traditional forms of literature in, let's say, short stories and poetry, and breaks free from what is considered normal. This whole theory kind of amplifies the term that nothing is set in stone. Everything is changeable as long as you have a different perspective. Postmodernism often questions established literary notions such as the narrative and even the author. Postmodernism can actually be seen having a lot of characteristics that can distinguish itself from other literary theories, such as fragmentation, unreliable narrators, and even paradoxes. Some say that it emerged in the post-World War II era, and postmodern works are actually seen as a reaction against Enlightenment thinking and modernist approaches to literature. A quote from Al Purdue is that if we are questioning, resisting the methods we use to build knowledge, such as science, religion, and language, then traditional literary notions are also thrown into free play, which is a term that we'll be talking about later. These include the narrative and the author. This essentially is saying that if science, religion, and language are able to be questioned, then why shouldn't literature be questioned as well? And there were many people that kind of contributed to postmodernism in the early 20th century. One of them being, as I said before, Jean Francis Lyotard, who was kind of a pioneer of the postmodernism movement. He was a French philosopher theorist of the 20th century, and his work opposed modern cultural movement. His book, The Postmodern Condition, introduced many to the ideology of postmodernism, essentially pioneered and showcased and paved the way for many other theorists and philosophers to come. To follow up from him, we see Jacques Derrida, and he was another 20th century French philosopher who coined the term free play, which kind of means to understand how interpretations can arise from literature, how people can see a phrase and how they can interpret it differently. He introduced the concept of deconstructionalism through his books, which also correlates directly with postmodernism. And he theorized that oftentimes we read and see one uniform truth through all the mediums, such as science, literature, even religion. We see one uniform truth, and that there are many expansive ways of thinking from that, and there shouldn't be just one method of thinking. Moving on, we see Roland Barthes, who was another French literary theorist who advocated for postmodernism. A lot of Frenchmen. He wrote the groundbreaking essay, The Death of an Author, and built upon Derrida's ideas of deconstructionalism. and kind of questioned the means of how narratives in literature are actually written. In his famous quote, he actually said, "Classical criticism has never paid any attention to the reader. The writer is the only person in literature. It is necessary to overthrow the myth. The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." And this is kind of crazy because it gives more power to the reader to interpret, not as much to the author who's writing it, but more to the reader who's intaking the information, which is another idea of deconstructionalism, which is what we're going to be talking about. Some key terms within postmodernism are free play, as I mentioned before, deconstruction, as I also mentioned before, meta-narratives, and minimalism. Now, free play is a method of interpreting text, and a more conclusive way of understanding it is by giving this example of how a lot of times when you read a page we can read it and understand it in our own. The phrase "time flies like an arrow," when you hear that, you automatically think time passes quickly. However, if read differently, it can mean something totally different. Time flies like an arrow. If you can see, if you use time as a verb, flies as an object, and like an arrow as an adverb clause, it could possibly mean get out your stopwatch and time the speed of flies as you would time an arrow's flight. Now, maybe time flies is a noun, like is a verb, and an arrow is an object. Time flies like an arrow. Time flies are fond of arrows, or at least one particular arrow. See, it can mean many things. Moving on back to the key terms, we see key terms like deconstructionism, which signifies certain strategies for reading and writing text, very similar to free play, that there are different methods of seeing and reading, writing text to interpret it differently. Meta-narratives are narratives about narratives of historical meaning, experience, and knowledge. The term meta comes from here, and we hear that a lot, as we hear that meta breaks the boundaries of what we consider real, which is something that meta-narratives do. Minimalism is also used within postmodernistic literary works, and we see that it is an arrangement of words and a focus on surface-level description, explaining a lot in as little as possible. Minimalism. Some key questions that arise when reading literary works are things that we can kind of consider using postmodernistic ideas. How does an author or character change throughout the story or reconstruct memory and identity of themselves? How does a work fulfill or move outside the established conventions of the specific genre that it's writing in? How does the work undermine or contradict generally accepted truths? How is it different? What ideologies does the text seem to promote? If we change the point of view of the text, say from one character to another, or multiple characters, how would the story change? A lot of these questions kind of derive from the theory that the story isn't what it seems. A work that we read in class that actually applies to postmodernistic theories is The Lottery, written by Shirley Jackson. And in it, we see the story of a group of individuals, a community, coming together to kind of stone a woman to death and being okay with that because of tradition. Now, the story strays away from conventional narratives and storytelling. There isn't really a main character, there is no definitive plot, but it strays away from how narratives are usually told. The Lottery asks a lot of the questions from the kind of slide before, which are what is happening in the story, how could this point of view change through the text if it was told from another perspective. Asks a lot of these kind of questions, and it can be interpreted in different ways. Maybe the story is telling us about the dangers of tradition and how sometimes being too involved in tradition can kind of corrupt a society in thinking that what they're doing is morally correct. Maybe it's telling readers that this is the outcome of economic poverty and even economic struggle. Or even possibly the lottery is a good thing that challenges readers to kind of question why they think that it's a bad thing. And that kind of adds on to the last point I say, which is that it challenges notions of keeping traditions within the story. So I think that within the story we can see that the lottery does amplify qualities of postmodernistic ideas and even works today that are very relatable and things that we can see. Postmodernism does a great job of giving power to the reader in terms of what he considers real and what he considers to be the reality, the canon, even. Postmodernism is a literary theory that is still implemented today and is actually used in a lot of literature that we read. This literary theory can be used to describe and discover different methods of how stories are told today.